It was supposed to be an ordinary day for Jamal and Aisha. A family of 3, they had just settled into their seats on Flight 280, a long-haul journey that would take them to the sunny beaches of Florida. The excitement of a week-long vacation filled the air as they buckled their seatbelts and prepared for takeoff. Their young daughter, Nia, was already fast asleep, her head resting comfortably against her mother's shoulder. It was a picture-perfect scene, a family of professionals, hard-working, and just like any other, seeking a little bit of relaxation. Jamal had always been the type to keep a low profile. He was a successful tech entrepreneur who had worked tirelessly to get to where he was, never one to boast or stand out in a crowd. His wife, Aisha, was no different. A respected lawyer, she had dedicated years to her craft, working long hours to build a reputation for herself. Together, they were the epitome of quiet success. They didn't feel the need to draw attention to themselves, they were comfortable in their own skin, content with the life they had built. However, as the plane began to taxi down the runway, their peace was about to be shattered. Jamal glanced at Aisha, noticing the subtle tension in her eyes. She always seemed to pick up on things before he did. Her gaze shifted around the cabin, scanning the people around them. Aisha had grown used to the subtle stares over the years, those fleeting glances that never quite met her eyes. She had grown up in an environment where such looks were common, but today, there was something different in the air. A flight attendant approached their row. She was in her late 20s, with striking blonde hair tied neatly in a bun, and a stern expression that suggested she wasn't one to tolerate disruptions. She paused for a moment as she surveyed the family, then spoke with an air of authority. "I'm sorry, but these seats are reserved for first-class passengers only," she said, her voice firm. Jamal blinked in confusion. "These are our seats," he replied calmly. "We've got the boarding passes to prove it." The flight attendant raised an eyebrow, her eyes scanning their tickets briefly before focusing back on the family. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. These seats are for first class. Please return to your assigned seats in coach." Aisha could feel the heat rising in her chest. She could sense the shift in tone, the judgment in the air, but she held her ground. They had booked these seats months in advance, and there was no mistake. She glanced down at Nia, still asleep, her little face serene amidst the growing tension. Jamal tried to remain calm. He had been through this kind of thing before, people assuming that he didn't belong in places like this, that he was somehow out of place. But today, on this flight, he wasn't going to let it slide. He stood up and gently placed his hand on Aisha's shoulder, signaling her to remain seated while he dealt with the situation. He showed the flight attendant their boarding passes again, and this time, her eyes lingered on them a little longer. There was no denying that they were in the right. But instead of apologizing or admitting a mistake, the attendant's demeanor shifted. She straightened her posture and looked at Jamal with barely concealed disdain. "I'm going to have to call security," she said coldly, her eyes never leaving his face. "You're causing a disruption." Jamal felt his pulse quicken, but he stayed calm. He had dealt with this kind of thing before. He had been a black man in predominantly white spaces long enough to know how this game was played. It wasn't new. But what shocked him was how quickly the flight attendant escalated the situation. He had seen people treated unfairly, sure, but this was different. It was as though the flight attendant had already made up her mind about who he was and where he belonged. Aisha's hand tightened around Nia's. She could feel the tension building between them, the unfairness of the situation seeping into her bones. She wanted to speak up, to demand an explanation, but she knew that doing so might make the situation worse. The flight attendant was already standing firm, unmoved by reason or facts. Minutes passed like hours. The flight attendants walked by, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. The rest of the passengers seemed uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or ignore the situation. And then, just as Jamal was about to insist that they were not leaving their seats, the door of the cockpit opened. The captain, a tall man with graying hair and a serious expression, stepped into the cabin. "I understand there's an issue here," he said, looking from the flight attendant to Jamal and Aisha. His tone was neutral, professional, but there was something else there, a flicker of recognition. The flight attendant seemed to hesitate for a split second. She had not expected the captain to intervene. But instead of offering a simple resolution, she responded with more aggression. "Yes, there is. This family refuses to leave their assigned seats," she said, her voice growing louder. "They're causing a disruption." The captain looked at Jamal again, a bit longer this time. "What's going on here, sir?" he asked, his gaze not quite meeting Jamal's eyes. Jamal's heart sank. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and he realized what was happening. The captain wasn't asking out of curiosity, he was asking because he too had already formed an opinion. "We're in our assigned seats," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. "These seats are ours, and we've shown our boarding passes twice. There's no reason for this." The captain turned back to the flight attendant, his expression unchanged. "I'll need to speak to the gate agents. Stay here for a moment." Jamal watched him walk toward the cockpit, frustration simmering under his skin. He had been ready for the fight, but something about the captain's dismissive attitude hit him harder than expected. The door to the cockpit closed with a loud click, and Jamal felt his chest tighten. Aisha leaned in close to him. "We're not going anywhere, Jamal," she whispered. "We've done nothing wrong." Jamal nodded, but he could feel his anger rising. This wasn't just about the seats. It was about something deeper, the assumption that because of the color of their skin, they didn't belong in first class. They were being treated like intruders in a space where they were paying customers. The injustice was suffocating. As they sat there, waiting for the captain's return, Jamal's mind raced. He had dealt with this kind of thing in small doses throughout his life: sneers, judgmental stares, people assuming he didn't belong where he was. But this was different. This was outright discrimination, and it was happening in front of his wife and daughter. Suddenly, the door to the cockpit opened again, but this time, there was more than just the captain. A man in a sharp suit, tall and with an air of authority, stepped onto the plane. Jamal's eyes widened as he recognized him: Darryl Matthews, the CEO of the airline. Darryl was a former college friend of Jamal's. They had met years ago at a business seminar, where they had bonded over their shared experiences as young black professionals trying to make their mark in a world that often overlooked them. They had kept in touch over the years, occasionally catching up on life and work. Jamal never imagined he would see Darryl again like this, especially not under these circumstances. But Darryl's expression quickly shifted from recognition to something else, a flicker of surprise and discomfort. He walked straight up to Jamal and offered a quick handshake. "Jamal?" Darryl said, his voice filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. "What's going on here?" Jamal couldn't believe it. Of all the moments in his life, of all the times he had crossed paths with people in the business world, this was the last time he expected Darryl to walk onto this plane. His old friend was the CEO of the very airline that had just accused him of being an intruder. "I'm sorry about this, Darryl," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just trying to get to our seats. But this flight attendant here has decided that we don't belong." Darryl looked over at the flight attendant, who was now visibly uncomfortable. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath as the CEO's gaze moved from the flight attendant to Jamal and back again. "What do you mean, you don't belong?" Darryl asked, his voice now laced with authority. "This is your airline. You have every right to be in those seats." The flight attendant's face went pale. Her mistake was becoming clear to everyone in the cabin. She had made a grave error, one that she could never undo. The truth was about to come out, and it would change everything. And with that, the tension in the air seemed to snap. The doors of the plane closed with a quiet thud, signaling the beginning of an extraordinary chain of events. The hum of the airplane engines blended with the awkward silence that settled over the cabin. Jamal could feel his pulse quicken as Daryl, the CEO, stood there, scanning the flight attendant with a look that could melt steel. He didn't need to say much for everyone to know that things had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The flight attendant, standing rigid with embarrassment, tried to regain control, but the damage was done. "You," Daryl began, his voice calm yet undeniably authoritative, "are making a mistake. These people, my people, belong here. This is their seat. They own this airline." The flight attendant blinked, her face drained of color. She looked at Daryl, back at Jamal, then down at the boarding passes once more, now realizing the magnitude of her blunder. She stammered, clearly flustered. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." "Clearly," Daryl interjected, his voice now laced with disappointment. He wasn't angry, he was, if anything, embarrassed. For Jamal, for Aisha, for Nia, and for everyone who had witnessed the unfolding disaster. The flight attendant, realizing she was losing control of the situation, stepped back as Daryl walked toward Jamal and Aisha. He extended his hand to Jamal with an earnest, apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry for this, Jamal. I had no idea." "If I had known," Daryl trailed off, but his gaze spoke volumes. He had known Jamal for years. They had both come from humble beginnings, both struggled to make a name for themselves in a world that wasn't always kind to men of color. And now, here they were, in the most absurd of circumstances, his own company, an airline that Jamal had helped launch as a small investor, now being the site of a humiliating racial misunderstanding. Jamal, still processing the whirlwind of events, took Daryl's hand with a tight grip. "It's fine, Daryl," he said, though his words carried the weight of years of accumulated frustration. "It's not about you. It's about the fact that we're still seen as out of place, as though we don't belong, even in a place where we have every right to be." His voice didn't waver, but the emotion behind his words hung thick in the air. Aisha, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up, her voice steady but resolute. "Jamal's right. This isn't about an apology. It's about the bigger issue, how people of color are constantly made to feel like they don't belong in spaces they've earned the right to occupy." Her eyes, sharp and clear, met Daryl's as she continued. "This isn't just about a seat on an airplane. This is about how we are treated every single day. By people who assume that because of the color of our skin, we don't deserve to be in certain rooms, certain places." Her voice echoed through the plane, cutting through the tension and making every word land like a punch. There was a raw honesty in her words that Jamal couldn't help but admire. She had always been the more outspoken one, the one who could confront uncomfortable truths head-on. Daryl, visibly shaken by her words, lowered his gaze. "I understand," he said quietly. "This shouldn't have happened. I'll handle this. Don't worry about it." As the plane continued to taxi down the runway, the captain returned, having overheard the exchange from the cockpit. His expression had shifted from cold professionalism to one of genuine concern. "Everything okay here, Daryl?" he asked, his eyes flicking between the flight attendant and the family. Daryl nodded. "Yes, it's fine now. These guests are important to me and to this airline." He turned to the flight attendant, who was still standing awkwardly to the side. "I want you to go to the back and think about what happened here today," Daryl said firmly, his tone brokering no room for argument. "You'll be reporting to my office when we land. And I want you to understand what you've done, because this kind of behavior is unacceptable." The flight attendant, who had once stood so tall with authority, now looked deflated. I understand," she muttered, almost as if the weight of her own ignorance had crushed her spirit. Without another word, she turned and walked quickly down the aisle, her head lowered in shame. For the first time since the encounter began, Jamal felt a slight sense of relief. The situation, while far from resolved, was starting to feel like it might be heading in the right direction. Daryl's intervention had shifted the momentum, but the damage had already been done. As the airplane slowly ascended into the sky, the family's thoughts were clouded by the sheer absurdity of what had just transpired. As the flight leveled off, Jamal leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting. He watched Nia, now awake and sipping on her juice, her face a picture of innocence. She hadn't witnessed the ugliness of what had happened. She was oblivious to the racial injustice that had unfolded mere feet away from her. And yet, for Jamal and Aisha, it was impossible to ignore. The incident had reopened old wounds, and he could feel a growing sense of resentment stirring within him. Aisha, ever the level-headed one, reached over and gently touched his hand. "Jamal," she said softly, her voice soothing. "This isn't the first time. You know that. But we have to keep pushing forward. We've come so far. We can't let moments like this derail us. We owe it to Nia." Jamal looked over at his wife, her strength always something he admired. She was right, of course. This wasn't the first time they had been treated like this, and it wouldn't be the last. The truth was that it didn't matter how successful they were, how much they had achieved or the status they held. In some people's eyes, they would always be out of place. But Jamal wasn't one to back down. He wasn't going to let this small moment define him, or his family, or their journey. "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But this needs to stop. It needs to be talked about. People can't keep getting away with this." Aisha nodded. "And it will. Today is just one chapter in a much bigger story. We've got a long way to go, but we're on the right path." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a flight attendant's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. Please sit back and enjoy the rest of your flight. Thank you for choosing us today." The irony of her words wasn't lost on Jamal. Here they were, at 35,000 feet, a family caught in a web of racial prejudice and misjudgment. All of them were simply passengers on a plane, just like everyone else. But some passengers had the privilege of being seen as equals, while others, like his family, were forced to fight against a lifetime of assumptions and prejudices. As the flight continued, the tension seemed to dissipate, though the impact of what had happened remained. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set into motion, a ripple effect that would reach far beyond this flight. When they landed, they would face consequences, yes, but they would also face a larger question. Was it just an isolated mistake, or was this a reflection of something deeper within the system? As they prepared for their descent, Jamal looked out the window, taking in the sprawling landscape below. It was a moment of quiet before everything would change. What had begun as a small mistake was now evolving into a revelation, one that would not only alter his family's trip but could very well have far-reaching consequences. He wasn't sure yet how this would unfold, but Jamal knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. The fight for fairness, for equality, for respect, had only just begun. As the plane descended toward the runway, the tension was palpable. Jamal sat there, his eyes fixed on the window, though he wasn't really seeing the landscape below. His mind was racing, turning over what had just happened, how it had all unfolded. He could still feel the sting of humiliation, the awkwardness of the flight attendant's actions, the way people had watched, some with discomfort, others with judgment, unsure of what was happening. But it wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the deeper realization that moments like this were not isolated events. This was part of something much larger, something that had been part of his life since childhood. Jamal's fingers tightened around the armrest as the plane's wheels made contact with the runway. A deep breath escaped his lungs, a release of the pent-up frustration that had been building for years. Aisha squeezed his hand gently, bringing him back to the present. "We're almost there," she said softly, her tone reassuring, though he could hear the concern in her voice. It wasn't just about the flight anymore, it was about what was coming next. The reality of their situation had shifted, and they both knew that this moment was far from over. What happened on that plane would follow them long after they had disembarked. As the plane taxied to the gate, Jamal's thoughts remained clouded. He could already feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, the whispers that would surely follow them as they left the plane. It wasn't just about a single misstep anymore, this was about the very system that allowed such errors to happen, and the very system that had allowed people like him and his family to be treated as second-class citizens, no matter how far they had come. For years, Jamal had worked hard to climb the corporate ladder, to prove himself, to build a life for his family that wasn't defined by their race. But moments like this reminded him that, for some people, none of that mattered. The plane came to a stop, and the seatbelt sign clicked off. Jamal, still processing everything, slowly stood up and grabbed his carry-on. Aisha did the same, but her movements were deliberate, her expression calm, though there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that was fueled by the injustice they had just experienced. Their daughter, Nia, was asleep in her seat, oblivious to the storm that had just raged around them. Jamal gently nudged her awake, and she blinked up at him, confused but smiling. "Are we home, Daddy?" she asked, her voice sweet, untainted by the harshness of the world around them. Jamal forced a smile, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Not yet, sweetheart. But soon." They made their way off the plane with a mix of urgency and caution. As they stepped into the terminal, Jamal felt the eyes of every person they passed. He could feel the whispers. The judgment. But there was something else, too, a sense of anticipation, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. Jamal wasn't sure what, exactly, but he had an unsettling feeling that this wasn't just going to end with their disembarkation. Daryl, who had been seated in the front of the plane, caught up with them as they exited the jet bridge. He was visibly distressed, his face a mask of guilt. "Jamal, Aisha," he said quickly, his voice low, "I need to speak with you. There's something you need to know. The flight attendant, she's been reassigned." He looked around as if making sure no one could overhear them. "And I'm personally overseeing the investigation into what happened today. But I think this situation goes deeper than just one employee's mistake. This is bigger than her." Jamal paused, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" he asked, already dreading the answer. He could feel his heart rate increasing, his pulse quickening as Daryl's words began to sink in. Daryl glanced nervously at the others in the terminal before continuing. "I've spoken to the company's board of directors," he said quietly. "And they've agreed to conduct a full review of our policies, especially regarding how we train our staff. We need to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. But I've also come to realize that, it's not just about the flight attendants. There are issues within the company's leadership, issues that trickle down into how we treat people, how we see them, how we assign value. This isn't just a bad apple situation. This is systemic." Jamal's chest tightened, a mix of frustration and vindication swirling inside him. He had known it all along, he had always known that this wasn't just one isolated incident. He had seen it in the way he was treated at business meetings, in the way people in positions of power would avoid eye contact with him, in the way his contributions were sometimes dismissed, no matter how solid they were. This was the reality that came with being a black man in a world that still wasn't ready to see him as an equal. Aisha, who had been silent up until that point, finally spoke. "What are you going to do about it, Daryl?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying an edge of impatience. "You're in a position of power. You have the ability to make a change here. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Daryl met her gaze, his eyes softening. "I'm going to make sure the changes happen," he said firmly. "But this is going to take time. It's going to take more than just one person. We need to change the culture from the ground up. This isn't something I can fix overnight. But I promise you, we'll get it right." Jamal wanted to believe him, but the reality was more complicated. "That's all well and good," he replied, his voice sharp. "But the damage has already been done. This wasn't just a matter of one person making a mistake. This is a failure of your system, your culture. And until you fix that, it won't matter what you promise." Daryl didn't argue. He knew Jamal was right. He'd spent years building his business, fighting to make it successful, but he had also grown complacent. He had assumed that his own company would automatically be free from the biases that plagued the world outside its walls. It wasn't until today, until he saw how his employees treated a family he considered friends, that he realized just how deeply ingrained those biases were, even within his own business. As they walked through the terminal, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably shifted. This wasn't just about an embarrassing incident on a plane anymore. It was about something much deeper, a reckoning that had only just begun. And, for better or worse, it was something he would have to confront, not just for himself, but for his family, for everyone who had been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. They reached the exit doors of the terminal, and Jamal paused, his thoughts heavy. He looked back at Daryl, who had fallen behind, and then turned his gaze to Aisha, her expression still determined. Together, they stepped out into the bustling world beyond, but the weight of what had just happened stayed with them. It was clear that the journey they had been on, one filled with success, with challenges, and now, with painful truth, was far from over. As they made their way through the parking lot to their car, Jamal couldn't help but wonder just how much longer it would take before people like him and his family were truly seen for who they were, not just as passengers, but as equals, as human beings who belonged. And as the doors of the car slammed shut behind them, the questions lingered. Would this be the turning point? Would this moment spark real change, or would it be another chapter in a long history of progress halted by prejudice? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: Jamal was done staying silent. If the world wouldn't change on its own, he was going to make sure his voice, and the voices of others who had been silenced for too long, were heard. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of anger that lingered, even as they made their way home. The events of the past few hours played in his mind like a loop, each detail sharper than the last. He could still hear the flight attendant's words, the way she had spoken to him, as though he were just another inconvenience to be dealt with. It wasn't just the way she had treated him, it was the entire experience, the subtle, almost imperceptible ways in which people like her, like so many others, saw him and his family as less than. He had spent so many years trying to prove otherwise, to rise above the prejudices that had always lingered on the periphery, but moments like these reminded him just how far he still had to go. By the time they arrived at their home, it was late, and the neighborhood was quiet. The lights in the windows of neighboring houses flickered softly, casting long shadows on the street. Jamal parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It was a symbol of everything he and Aisha had worked for, every late night, every sacrifice, every decision made with the hope that one day, their daughter would inherit something more than just their wealth. She would inherit a legacy of resilience, a determination to rise above the challenges they faced. Inside, their daughter, Nia, was already asleep, her small form curled up in the bed they had carefully chosen for her. Jamal and Aisha exchanged a quiet glance, the weight of the day settling heavily between them. They had tried to shield Nia from the ugly realities of the world, but the world had a way of forcing its way in. They knew, deep down, that their daughter would face the same struggles they had, no matter how much they tried to protect her. The fight for equality was not one that could be won overnight, and certainly not one they could fight alone. Aisha's voice broke the silence. "What now, Jamal?" Her words were quiet, but there was a steeliness to them, an unspoken resolve. "What happens now?" Jamal exhaled deeply, running his hands through his hair as he leaned back in the chair. He hadn't expected this question, at least not so soon. He had been hoping for a moment of respite, for the chance to recover, but Aisha wasn't giving him that luxury. She wasn't one to wait for things to fall into place, she wanted action. And Jamal couldn't fault her for that. He was right there with her, but the weight of the situation felt like a burden he couldn't carry alone. "We fight," he said, his voice firm. "We don't let this go. Not just for us, but for everyone who's been made to feel less than. This thing, it's bigger than a mistake by a flight attendant. This is about a culture. This is about how we're treated, how we're viewed, and how we let it continue to happen. If we don't speak up, if we don't push back, nothing changes." Aisha nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She understood the stakes. She understood the fight they were facing. It wasn't just about one incident, it was about every incident that had come before it, every indignity that had been quietly swept under the rug. But Jamal also understood that pushing back came with its own set of challenges. He had spent years building a reputation in business, forging relationships with influential people, and trying to maintain an image of success. Speaking out now, standing up for himself, would likely come with a price. He could lose clients, he could lose opportunities, and he could lose the fragile veneer of respectability that he had worked so hard to construct. But that price was nothing compared to the cost of silence. He knew that now. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. News of the incident had spread quickly, not through any public announcement but through the whispers that always followed moments like these. Within the first 24 hours, Jamal received multiple calls from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had heard about what happened on the plane. Some of them expressed their support, offering apologies and sympathy. Others were more cautious, questioning what exactly had transpired and whether Jamal was exaggerating the incident. There was always someone who doubted, someone who couldn't quite grasp the depth of what had occurred. And then there were the emails, so many emails. Messages of solidarity, from people of all races and backgrounds, who had experienced similar treatment and wanted to share their stories. They expressed their frustration, their anger, and their exhaustion with the system that allowed such things to happen. And yet, amid all the support, there was still a pervasive undertone of disbelief. Some didn't want to acknowledge the pain that had been inflicted, some even went so far as to argue that Jamal and his family had misunderstood the situation. That it was a simple mistake, a misunderstanding that could easily be fixed with a quick apology and a few lessons on customer service. But Jamal knew better. He had seen firsthand how apologies meant nothing without real action behind them. And real action was what they needed now. He called Daryl, the CEO of the airline, to demand answers. Daryl had been quiet for the past few days, as if weighing his options, but Jamal wasn't willing to wait any longer. When Daryl finally picked up, his voice was strained, as though he had been anticipating this conversation. "I know why you're calling," Daryl said. "And I know this situation has gotten out of hand. I'm doing everything I can to investigate what happened. But..." "Don't give me the but," Jamal interrupted, his voice sharp. "We both know this isn't just about one flight attendant. This is about a system, a culture, and you know it as well as I do. What are you going to do about it?" Daryl was silent for a long moment, and for a brief second, Jamal wondered if he was even going to respond. He had seen enough of this type of corporate double talk to know when someone was stalling. But when Daryl spoke again, his voice was steadier. "You're right," he said finally. "This isn't just about one incident. I've already instructed my team to re-evaluate everything, from training to policies, to how we handle customer complaints. We're going to make real changes. And I want you to be a part of it." Jamal's heart raced. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when he would be asked to step in, to play a role in shaping the company's future. But it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. Not until he saw tangible change. "I'm listening," Jamal replied, his tone still cold but tinged with the hope of what was to come. "But actions speak louder than words. You know what I want." "I'll make it happen," Daryl assured him. You'll be involved every step of the way. We're going to fix this. As Jamal hung up, he stared at his phone for a long moment. He wanted to believe Daryl. He wanted to believe that the changes he had been promised would come to fruition. But something deep inside him told him that this battle was far from over. The real fight hadn't even started yet. The next few weeks were a blur. Jamal and Aisha took on the dual responsibilities of holding the airline accountable while also protecting their family's well-being. They met with community leaders, with activists, with lawyers, anyone who could help them understand the full scope of what had happened and how they could push for change. Jamal gave interviews to local news outlets, recounting his story, his experience, and what needed to be done to prevent others from facing the same treatment. It wasn't easy. Each interview felt like a battle, a confrontation with the harsh realities that he had always known but never fully confronted. At the same time, the ripple effect of the incident reached beyond just Jamal and his family. It touched people they had never met, people who had endured similar injustices, who felt empowered by Jamal's willingness to speak up. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the thousands of others who had felt marginalized, ignored, and voiceless. In the quiet moments, when Jamal and Aisha were alone, they allowed themselves to hope that this time, real change would come. But they also knew that it would take time, perhaps more time than they had expected. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were not going to let this incident be forgotten. Not until the world saw them for who they were. Not until the world saw all of them. And as they continued to fight, they did so with the unwavering knowledge that no matter what happened next, they were part of something much bigger than themselves. They were part of a movement that had the power to change everything. As the weeks stretched on, Jamal and Aisha found themselves in a strange, liminal space, still reeling from the events, yet propelled forward by an unyielding momentum. The airline had made promises, but promises were just words until actions were taken. Every call, every meeting, every conversation with the media or the public felt like it was leading to something much larger. They were no longer just fighting for recognition or a simple apology, they were fighting for an entire system to change, one that had allowed their treatment, and the treatment of so many others, to go unnoticed, unchecked. But there was also a quiet undercurrent of fatigue, a sense that the battle was draining them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The phone calls, the interviews, the public statements, each day felt like it demanded more than the last. Despite their best efforts to remain resolute, there were moments when the weight of the situation became too much to bear. One evening, after another exhausting day of meetings and media coverage, Jamal collapsed onto the couch in their living room. The house, once a place of solace, now felt suffocating. Aisha was in the kitchen, preparing a late dinner for Nia, who had been unusually quiet that day. It had been hard to shield her from the ripple effects of what had happened. School had become a battleground in its own right, with some of the children asking questions that Nia wasn't ready to answer. The world outside had begun to change, but the world inside their home was still struggling to adjust. Jamal's phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was an email from Daryl, the CEO of the airline. He hesitated before opening it. There had been so many emails over the past few weeks, some of them apologetic, others defensive, but none had come close to the weight of this one. When he opened it, the first line hit him like a punch: "We are implementing the changes we discussed. I want you to be part of our reform committee." Jamal read the email again. Then a third time. The email contained a list of proposed changes, some of which seemed promising, others less so. There was talk of improved training, diversity initiatives, and a revision of customer service protocols. But none of it felt as concrete as he had hoped. There was a part of him that had expected more, a more immediate, far-reaching action. Instead, it felt like a carefully crafted PR response, designed to appease without truly addressing the deeper issues at play. When Aisha came into the room, Jamal looked up from the screen, his face unreadable. "What is it?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. It's Daryl, Jamal said, holding up the phone. He wants me to be part of their reform committee. Aisha's expression remained neutral, but Jamal could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything for Jamal to know what she was thinking. They had both been here before, promises made in the heat of the moment, only to be quietly abandoned once the public eye shifted elsewhere. Jamal wanted to believe that this time would be different, but the cynicism that had taken root in him over the years made it hard to trust. I don't know if I trust it, he admitted, his voice tinged with exhaustion. It feels too little, too late. Aisha sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his. I understand, she said softly. But this is what we've been fighting for, right? To make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. If we don't push them, who will? Jamal's shoulders slumped as he considered her words. She was right, of course. This fight wasn't just for him, and it wasn't just for their family. It was for the countless others who had experienced what they had, perhaps worse. He knew that by taking this step, he could influence real change, even if it meant enduring more of the exhaustion and frustration that had plagued him in the weeks since the incident. But the thought of sitting in that committee, talking to the very people who had been complicit in his humiliation, made his skin crawl. I don't want this to become about us, Jamal said quietly, almost to himself. I don't want this to be some corporate charade where they pretend they've learned a lesson, and nothing really changes. Aisha squeezed his hand, offering him a reassuring smile. We've seen how these systems work, Jamal. It's not going to be easy. But change doesn't happen overnight. You have a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. You can make sure that this company does more than just talk about diversity and inclusion. It was a compelling argument, one that made sense on a logical level. Jamal knew that this wasn't just about him, or even just about the airline. It was about the way people like him, like his family, were treated day in and day out, in ways both overt and subtle. It was about shifting the narrative and ensuring that their voices, so often marginalized, were heard. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and negotiations. Jamal agreed to join the reform committee, with a caveat that his involvement would be contingent on the implementation of real, measurable changes. He pushed for transparency, insisting that the airline share their progress with the public regularly. And, perhaps most importantly, he demanded that the voices of those who had been silenced, like the flight attendants, like the passengers who had witnessed the incident, be included in the conversation. Meanwhile, the public response to Jamal's involvement with the airline was mixed. Some saw it as a victory, a sign that change was on the horizon. Others criticized him for getting involved with a company that had hurt him and his family. The backlash came as a surprise. Especially from people who had supported him early on. But Jamal understood why they felt the way they did. It was hard to imagine a world where someone could be part of the very system that had wronged them, let alone trust that system to change. But Jamal wasn't naive, he knew that true reform wouldn't come from just tearing everything down. It had to come from within. And if he could be part of that process, then perhaps this fight hadn't been for nothing. As the weeks turned into months, Jamal continued to push for real changes at the airline. He attended committee meetings, worked with other members to develop policies that prioritized diversity and inclusion, and used his platform to hold the company accountable. The process was slow, but it was happening. And for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt like he was part of something that mattered. One evening, as Jamal and Aisha sat down to dinner with Nia, their daughter asked a simple question that cut through the weight of everything they had been through. Daddy, did you fix it? Did you make it better? Jamal paused, looking into his daughter's wide, trusting eyes. For a moment, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, but he also felt something else, a glimmer of hope. He didn't have all the answers, and he couldn't promise that everything would be perfect. But he could promise that he was doing everything in his power to make sure the world Nia grew up in would be better than the one he had inherited. "I'm working on it, baby," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're all working on it." Aisha smiled, her hand resting gently on his. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like enough. They were all working on it. And that, Jamal realized, was the most important thing of all. As the months passed, Jamal continued his work with the airline, but the changes weren't immediate. It was a slow, grinding process that required patience, persistence, and a constant reminder of why they had started in the first place. And as they sat together, as a family, Jamal found himself reflecting not only on the fight he had chosen but on the impact it had had on their community. The people they had spoken to, the stories they had heard, and the solidarity that had emerged from the ashes of that single incident had sparked something far more significant than they had ever anticipated. Their voices, once silenced, had been heard. And even if the fight wasn't over, they had already made a difference. For Jamal and Aisha, the journey was far from finished, but they were no longer fighting alone. They were part of something greater than themselves, something that, in time, would change the world. As the seasons changed and time marched forward, Jamal, Aisha, and Nia found themselves in a new phase of their lives. The initial storm of public scrutiny and corporate tension had died down, but its effects lingered, shaping the path ahead. Their efforts to change the airline and make the system more equitable had not been without sacrifice. Jamal had spent countless hours on the reform committee, sacrificing time with his family, his personal life, and his peace of mind. Aisha, too, had felt the weight of it all, supporting Jamal through the endless meetings, media appearances, and the internal struggle he faced between staying true to his convictions and working within a system that had once wronged him. Nia, with her youthful optimism, often asked if everything was better now, not fully understanding the magnitude of the work her parents were doing. But she could sense the change, the way her parents carried themselves, the way they talked about their work, the way they were determined to make a real difference. The journey had transformed them. It had not been a smooth or easy process, but each challenge they faced brought them closer to their purpose. They had been thrust into a situation they never imagined, one that seemed absurd at first, a black family being kicked off a plane, only to later reveal that they owned the airline. But what began as a personal injustice had grown into a movement that reached far beyond them. Jamal's involvement in the reform committee had spurred a broader conversation about diversity, inclusion, and equity, not just within the airline industry, but across sectors. People who had never before considered the importance of representation in corporate spaces began to question the status quo. The narrative was shifting, slowly but surely. Still, there were moments of doubt. Jamal, despite all the progress he had seen, sometimes found himself questioning whether it was enough. There had been backlash from both within the airline and the larger public. Some accused him of selling out, of betraying the very community that had rallied behind him when the incident first occurred. Others argued that the changes he was pushing for were too little too late. These criticisms stung, even if he tried not to let them show. He had never asked for the spotlight. He never wanted to be a symbol of corporate reform. He had simply wanted to right a wrong. But the weight of expectation had grown as the campaign for change gained traction. And yet, despite the criticisms, there were victories. Small ones at first: policies changed, training programs implemented, diversity hires made, but those victories were not just numbers on a piece of paper. They represented something much deeper, a cultural shift within an organization that had long been resistant to change. Jamal had been steadfast in his approach. He made it clear from the start that if the airline was truly committed to reform, they needed to be transparent. They needed to measure their progress, share it with the public, and involve those most affected in the decision-making process. Slowly, the airline had started to heed those calls. Their public statements became more authentic, their actions more deliberate. They were far from perfect, but they were trying. The world around Jamal was changing, too. The ripple effect of the incident had reached communities far beyond the airline, touching families, activists, and individuals who had been quietly suffering under similar circumstances. Jamal's story had become a symbol of perseverance, of standing up for what's right in the face of insurmountable odds. It was a story that resonated with many, especially in communities where people of color often felt overlooked or undervalued. His willingness to take on a giant corporation, not just for personal gain but for systemic change, had inspired countless others to fight their own battles. Aisha, too, had grown throughout this journey. She had always been supportive of Jamal's ambitions, but she had never imagined that her quiet life would become intertwined with the fight for corporate reform. Yet, here she was, not just standing beside her husband, but actively contributing to the conversation. Aisha had become a voice of reason within the movement, advocating for balance between personal well-being and systemic change. She often reminded Jamal that while fighting for justice was essential, it was just as important to protect their family, to nurture their relationships, and to ensure that they did not lose themselves in the process. For Nia, the experience had been eye-opening, though in ways she couldn't fully grasp. She had watched as her parents fought to make the world a better place. But there were moments of quiet that haunted her, the nights when Jamal stayed up late drafting emails or the times when Aisha would disappear into another meeting. Nia had come to understand that justice wasn't something that could be won overnight. It was a slow and steady process, one that required patience, resilience, and unwavering dedication. She was growing up in a world that had already begun to shift, but it was a shift that would continue throughout her life. She was learning, perhaps without fully realizing it, what it meant to fight for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As Jamal's role within the Reform Committee deepened, so did his understanding of the complexities involved in systemic change. He began to see that even well-meaning individuals and organizations could falter when it came to addressing deep-rooted issues of race, class, and power. He realized that while the airline had made progress, there were still layers of resistance, often buried beneath polite gestures and well-crafted statements. True change, he understood, could not be achieved through superficial fixes alone. It had to come from within, from a place of genuine understanding and commitment. One of the most powerful moments in Jamal's journey came when he was invited to speak at a corporate conference on diversity and inclusion. The event was attended by executives, policymakers, and influencers from various industries. As Jamal took the stage, he felt a surge of emotions. He wasn't just representing himself or his family. He was representing everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated because of the color of their skin. As he shared his story, his words resonated with the audience in a way that no one had expected. He spoke of the importance of accountability, of acknowledging past mistakes, and of building a future where everyone had an equal chance to succeed. The room was silent as he spoke, and when he finished, there was a standing ovation. In that moment, Jamal realized that the impact of his actions had gone far beyond the walls of the airline. He was part of something bigger, something that was changing the world for the better. It wasn't just about fixing one airline or making one company more inclusive. It was about creating a ripple effect, one that would inspire others to take up the mantle of change in their own communities. It was about making sure that his daughter, and every other child growing up in a world filled with inequality, would have a future where they could thrive. But Jamal also understood that the fight wasn't over. The journey they had embarked on was one that would continue for generations to come. It was a fight for justice, for dignity, and for the recognition of the inherent worth of every human being. And although they had made significant strides, there was still much to be done. There would be new battles, new challenges, and new obstacles to overcome. But Jamal was no longer the man he had been when this all started. He had changed, evolved, and grown stronger. He had learned to channel his pain into purpose, his anger into action. And as he looked at Aisha and Nia, he knew that their fight was not just for today, but for a future that they would all share, a future where justice and equality were not just ideals, but realities. In the end, Jamal, Aisha, and Nia had not just changed an airline. They had changed the world around them. Their story had become a symbol of hope, reminder that even in the darkest of times, change was possible. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, to the belief that one person, one family, could make a difference. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that their journey was far from over. But they also knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family, united in their determination.